Так, уважаемые коллеги, присутствуют.
Dear colleagues, dear participants, today is the 21st of September, 4 o'clock Moscow time. So let's consider the Dissertation Council be considered open. It is dedicated to the work by Tsaregorodtsev in the major 230001, Theory and Philosophy of Politics, History and Methodology of Political Sciences, by Tsaregorodtsev Sergey, on the topic Francis Bacon's concept of public consent, political-technological analysis, by the order of the Scientific Secretary of St. Petersburg State University, Kenyatta Felix Andinich, 8061/1. I, Guterres Evgeny Alexandrovich, the head of the Department of Theory of Politics, was appointed the head of the Dissertation Council. The same order appointed the members of the Dissertation Council. Let me introduce them. Volkova Alexandra Vladimirovna, the Doctor of Political Sciences; Kulakova Tatiana Vladimirovna, the Doctor of Political Sciences, the Professor of Political Strategy at St. Petersburg State University; Mikhailenko, Doctor of Political Sciences, the head of the Institution of Sociology and the Federal Sociological Research Center of the Academy of Sciences; and Karib Baltazh-Mikobetovich, the Doctor of Political Sciences, the Professor of the Department of Art, Kazakhstan. The applicant himself, Tsaregorodtsev Sergey, is present with us today. Also, in the remote access mode, the supervisors, Alexander Andreevich, the Doctor of Political Sciences, Professor, the head of the Department of History of Political Sciences of Moscow Lomonosov University, is in the remote access mode. Dear colleagues, those in the remote access mode, please turn off your microphones, but please do not forget to turn them on when you're given the floor. We would also like to remind you that we conduct the broadcast of the session online, and translation is being provided. On the website, one can see the email address to which all the information can be directed, which might be related to the scientific discussion and thus take part in the scientific discussion. All the questions will be voiced by the chairperson. The questions are to be related to the speech by the applicant and the content of the thesis. It is necessary to indicate the name, surname, the job position. All the questions not linked to the scientific discussion and the appraisal of the thesis, as well as anonymous ones, will not be voiced. In accordance with the order of awarding scientific degrees of Candidate of Sciences and the Doctor of Sciences, which is approved by the order, the Dissertation Council is valid if no less than 2/3 of the approved members of the Dissertation Council participate in it. Our Dissertation Council consists of 5 people, or 5 people are present. Thus, we have quorum. I would like to ask the curator of the defense to issue the turnout list. The following procedure of the Dissertation Council with the approximate duration of 2 hours is the following. First, brief information on the applicant and the documents provided by the applicant and their compliance with the rules. Answers to possible questions, about 5 minutes. Second, brief presentation by the applicant on the key provisions of the work. Third, questions to the applicant based on the presentation, no more than 2 minutes per question. Answers of the applicant, no more than 5 minutes per all. 5. Presentations of the speeches of the members of the Dissertation Council in turn, with questions and suggestions to the applicant. 6. Speech by the chairperson with the appraisal of the thesis, about 10 minutes. The answers of the applicant, no more than 20 minutes. Open discussion, speeches of those present at the defense of the thesis, with stating brief their position, specific questions or suggestions to the applicant. All those willing to participate in that discussion should sign the turnout list. 9. The chairperson provides the voices the questions that were received during the live broadcast of the Dissertation Council meeting on St. Petersburg State University webcast. All the written questions which require 10 minutes to be voiced will not be voiced. Then the answers of the applicant. 11. Speech by the scientific supervisor. 12. The discussion by the members of the Dissertation Council before the open roll call, during which the sound is muted. Open roll call, counting of votes with the subsequent entry of the result into the minutes of the meeting. 14. Taking the decision on awarding or non-awarding the scientific degree. And 15. The final word of the applicant. No more than 2 minutes. Dear colleagues, are there any questions or objections to the regulations? Seeing there are none, then I'd like to start following the rules of procedure. First of all, I'd like to ask you to mute the sound of your mobile phones. All those online, I'd like to ask you not to turn off your mobile phone for prompt to the opportunity to get in touch with you in case of technical failure. I act myself as a role model by turning off my mobile phone. I hope that all the phones have been switched off. So I start the meeting. The thesis by Tsaregorodtsev Sergey Stanislavovich for the candidate of political sciences, scientific major 2300, theory and philosophy of politics and methodology of political sciences, on the topic Francis Bacon's concept of public consent, political-technological analysis, was taken for defense by the order of the 12th of August 2021, number 7969/1. Sergey Tsaregorodtsev wrote the thesis based on Moscow State University. Scientific advisor is Doctor of Political Sciences, Professor, the head of the Department of the History of Social Political Sciences of Moscow State University, Zhirinyans Alexander Andreevich. The number of published works by the applicants, which reflect the key results of the thesis, are 20 in the reviewed publications from the Ministry of Russian Education 4, indexed in Web Science Scopus 2. The applicant provided to the Academic Secretary at St. Petersburg State University the whole package of all the documents that correspond to point 12 of section 3 of the order. According to the information that I have received from the curator, comply to the requirements and can be found in the attestation file of the applicant. The copies can also be found with the representative of the Department of the Dissertation Council. Before giving the floor to the applicant, my question is it necessary to voice the entire list of all the documents presented for defense? There are no questions, so we can proceed. Sergey Stanislavovich, the floor is yours. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Dear Chairperson of the Dissertation Council, all the members of the Dissertation Council, all those present. I would like to give the presentation on my thesis dedicated to the concept of consent by Francis Bacon. You can see the topic of my dissertation on the slide. The relevance of the study is determined by a number of circumstances. It's known that sustainable existence and progressive evolutionary development of the Russian political system implies the preservation of consensus that has been achieved in society. First of all, by ensuring interaction and constructive dialogue between the authorities and civil society institutions. Scientific research on the concept of public consent as a tool for real politics includes the study of the history and historiography of the issue, which give an understanding of what was done by the predecessors. The research is based on the fundamental works of Francis Bacon, first of all in the 14-volume collection of his work published by the University of Cambridge. In addition, materials of a documentary biographical nature concerning his creative and political activities are used. Many works are devoted to the study of Bacon's legacy, both in our country and abroad. However, there are a number of reasons that make us return to his work. First of all, even more than for in scientific literature, one of the most priority areas is the analysis of the concept of consent and the associated concepts of public consent, informed consent. Then, in the domestic historiography, there are practically no work affecting modern discussions on the problem of social harmony, in works considering the genesis of concept of social consent. The authors draw in an extensive historical and political material from antiquity to the works by Machiavelli and Hobbes. Do not take into account the works of Bacon. On the whole, historiographic analysis shows that there is no single work in the scientific literature that examined the heritage by Francis Bacon through the lens of the formation and development of the concept of social consent. This determined the goal and objectives of the research. At the same time, it should be noted that the authors of many previous published studies and works created important prerequisites when considering the creative heritage of Francis Bacon in this aspect with the formulation of new scientific problems. The aim of the research is the political and textological analysis of Francis Bacon's concept of social harmony. To achieve this goal, it was necessary to solve the following tasks. Consider the historical context of the formation of the views of Bacon. Identify ideological and theoretical origins of Bacon's work. Define scientific and political priorities in the life and work of Bacon. To show the role and place of the concept of political stability in the work of Bacon. Please pay attention to the screen. The novelty of the research is due to the fact that firstly in the work, for the first time for domestic science, political and textological analysis of Bacon's works was conducted, which showed that this work and activities are closely related to political practice, and they were subject to the goals of achieving social harmony, maintaining political stability in English society. Secondly, the work introduced into scientific circulation a large array of the largest foreign sources and literature, representing the main directions of interpretation of this concept of consent in modern Western political science. Studied various versions of interpretation of the concept in the works of Francis Bacon. The scientific novelties are reflected in a number of specific provisions and conclusions. One of them start from the role and place of the concept of political stability. Please pay attention to the slide. The provisions for defense are also linked to the novelty. You can see them in the next slide as well. The thesis itself consists of introduction to chapters and the list of references. The first chapter is dedicated to the prerequisites of the legacy of Francis Bacon. The first paragraph is dedicated to the historical context of the formation of the ideas by Bacon. It is shown that an essential factor in the formation of Bacon's civic position and his views was the general political atmosphere that developed in England in the 16th century, in which, along with the rule of law and the sustaining role of Parliament, as Bacon himself noted, the state course of the English monarchs of Henry VII and then Elizabeth becomes the concern for the common peace in the country. In the second paragraph devoted to the ideological and theoretical origins of Francis Bacon's work, the deep foundation of his work is shown. It is noted that in his scientific research and state activities, Bacon relied on the teachings of outstanding thinkers of antiquity and modern times, using a wide variety of sources from Plato to Aristotle to Machiavelli and Montaigne. The third paragraph examines the scientific and political priorities of Francis Bacon. A direct study of the documents characterizing his life and work show that political activity occupied most of the life of Francis Bacon, and the political and scientific activities of the thinker were closely related, subordinated to the same political goals. The second chapter, devoted to theoretical and methodological foundation of Bacon's concept of public consent, includes 4 paragraphs. The first paragraph examines the role and place of the concept of political stability in the work of Bacon. The impending social cataclysm at the end of the 16th century forced the authorities to seek ways that would contribute to the settlement of the accumulated contradictions. In this regard, it becomes clear that Francis Bacon's activities as a politician and as a scientist was largely aimed at solving the problem of preserving political stability in the country. It's most interesting that, assessing the totality and consistency of political goals set by Francis Bacon, we can say that they are subject to a simple and understandable logic, which boils down to the following imperatives. Please pay attention to the screen. As a result, a close organic connection is revealed between the political and philosophical studies of the thinker, and in consequence, a deep connection between his political activity and scientific creativity. The second paragraph analyzes the theoretical foundation of the concept of public consent. You can see them in the slide. The third paragraph of the second chapter is devoted to assessing the ways to achieve social harmony. Bacon associates the solution of this problem with a set of measures of political, economic, legal, social, and ideological content. In the last 4th paragraph of the second chapter, the question is raised about the concept of consent of Francis Bacon in the context of modern political theory. It is shown that the content of Bacon's concept of consent in foreign literature is constantly updated. In fact, it has become an important element of scientific discourse. In modern political science and political theory, the study of the political and philosophical heritage of Francis Bacon as a whole and the concept of consent developed in his work are determined by the following tendencies. Please pay attention to the screen. They are demonstrated on the screen. The work also highlights the characteristic features of the discussion between the proponents of liberalism, where the human individual, his opinion, are referred to the primary essence, and supporters of communitarianism, gravitating toward the theory of collectivism to the recognition of certain principles and beliefs as universal in a mandatory manner. Special attention is paid to the theory of consent of the American scientist Alan Gilbert, presented in his work The Community of Rights, which became the object of serious scientific discussion. It rightly notes that the activities of modern political institutions, including those in the United States, can become effective if the method of consent is taken into account. Its main features would require access to civil liberties for all adults and the use of freedoms in solving issues of social and political life. In the conclusion, summarizing the results of the study, it is emphasized that the topic of social consent in the work of Bacon has many turns of the research plan, which is difficult to reflect or identify in one work. Realizing this, is possible to define a number of issues and problems awaiting their solutions. The following ideas might be listed, revealing the degree of influence of Bacon's concept of social consent on the formation of European socio-political thought in the 17th century and until the study of the modern-day political riots and measures of their prevention. Consideration of Francis Bacon's works from the point of view of achieving consent and political stability in the society gives it the heritage and important characteristics in the context of the history of socio-political doctrines and political philosophy. The ideas of Bacon strengthen the understanding of the universal historical meaning, which covers all temporal dimensions of human life. Finally, with regard to approbation of the research results, its main provisions and conclusions were presented in 21 scientific works, as well as in the author's speeches at 13 scientific conferences. Thank you for your attention. The report is over. Thank you very much. Take your seat, please. Dear colleagues, are there any questions to the presenter? Are there any questions? Seeing there are none, we'll move on to the next stage of the procedure. First of all, I'd like to ask you, Sergey Stanislavovich, will you provide the answers to the remarks after each speech in turn, or after all the speeches? Yes, after all the speeches. Thank you. I'd like to address the technical staff. Are there any external reviews? No external reviews are being received. Then we proceed with the speeches by the members of the Dissertation Council. Anna Vladimirovna, well, let's begin with you, please. Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, following the logic of the review, I need to talk about the novelty of the topic, which is beyond doubt. And unfortunately, our modern domestic political thought pays so little attention to the concept that praises Bacon and his interpretation of this concept and its modern interpretation. Thus, it's great that the author addressed this topic and developed the modern political science in this respect. I wanted to ask why such an interesting approach to Francis Bacon was caused. I had the version that maybe it is linked to certain contradiction with the British Empire, so there might be some deep political basis and deep political ground why Bacon was not so much regarded in our modern domestic science. Sergey Stanislavovich, for the first time in the history of modern science, discusses different versions and interpretations of the concept. In particular, the theory of concept for Russian political science and political culture is a topic of crucial importance. The object of the dissertation thesis, the logic of the thesis, everything complies with the topic. Thus, the structure of the work is clear-cut, and the text and the conclusions conform to the goals and objectives that were stated in the introduction. The detailed description of the work by, for instance, Bacon in politics and administrative work is a very positive side of the work. The analysis of practical work by, for instance, Bacon and theoretical developments by the author are very well combined. The thesis is a finished research paper which is of high quality, with detailed approach to the issues discussed, and a very sensitive attitude to the text and the depth of the analysis. And I would also like to note that not often on such a level we can see such a fact that the language of the text is marvelous. The text is read easily and it has no stylistic flaws or typos. The text is easy to read, very pleasant to read, but at the same time it is very deep if we talk about the conceptual part of the text. Moreover, the quality of the reference list is marvelous. It's more than 400 reference books, and some of the works are in English. Thus, the author not only introduces many researchers, of course, know several foreign languages, but the fact that the applicant comments the sources, comments the texts, analyzes and summarizes the information, thus acts not only as a translator and interpreter, but these texts and these translations support the general logic of the work and serve the above-mentioned goals. The second chapter is of special interest, since it analyzes not only the concept by Francis Bacon, but certain modern issues are touched upon, which at first might seem to be not linked to Francis Bacon, the idea of the informed consent. And I suppose that this research and this type of research is very fruitful and has a lot of potential, so it will not finish with this only thesis, and the author has a great potential for development. I did not identify any specific flaws. Of course, if we talk about the defense of the thesis, there are supposed to be some negative remarks, but the thing is that the information presented in the introduction according to goals and targets was fully carried out in the work. And I would like to say that the thesis, the Francis Bacon concept of public consent, political-textological analysis, presented for defense to obtain the degree of candidate of political sciences, complies to all the requirements by the order on the procedure of awarding scientific degrees, and the applicant Tsaregorodtsev Sergey deserves to be awarded the scientific degree of the candidate of sciences, major 230001, theory of politics and methodology of political sciences. Thank you for your attention. And we give the floor to Karipa Baltash. My review of the thesis by Tsaregorodtsev, Sergey Stanislavovich, Francis Bacon's concept of public consent, political-textological analysis, major 230001, the theory of politics and methodology of politics. Scientific research as an instrument of real politics should include the study of science, history and historiography. This is applied to the works by Francis Bacon, whose works allow us to understand the link between philosophical, theoretically, methodological and political ideas and the forms of political practice. Nowadays, the ideas of consent and informed consent, public consent, form the key aspects in political philosophy, which are most recent. And the recent research papers focus on different interpretations of the idea of consent. As for a domestic approach, consent is usually viewed as a way to avoid conflicts by compromising. One of the key positive features of the thesis is that It shows how the theoretical principles of the concept of consent, developed by Francis Bacon together with Hobbes and Locke, have their innovative value and lie the basis of arguments which can be found in the political science. It is worth noting that the applicant analyzed the theory of consent created by Alan Harvard, characterized the heuristic importance of the principle of joint consent. And for the first time in domestic science, the applicant identified the key ideas of the discussion of those who support Harvard's theory and who oppose it. It is absolutely clear that the theory of consent may become active and logical if mute consent is interpreted in a way that it can create mutual responsibility of rulers and those subjects. On the whole, there are certain level of quality of the whole dissertation thesis. Nevertheless, there are a couple of remarks. Francis Bacon is the subsequent idea to Hobbes. Who led Thomas Hobbes, one of the authors of the theory of public agreement. And we know that Bacon had a very limited idea of Thomas Hobbes. The author of the thesis needs to ponder upon this topic and provide additional information. What is more, there is a certain disproportion of the parts of the work. Thus, the fourth paragraph of the second chapter is much larger than the remaining paragraphs. Nevertheless, the reviewed work is performed at a high level. It has novelty and has practical importance. The language used in the thesis is of high quality. All the provisions for defense, the conclusions, comply with the above mentioned goals and targets. The results of the dissertation can be found in 21 scientific work, including 4 articles that make part of the magazines from the Ministry of Russian Education list, 2 index in the databases Web of Science and Scopus. Thus, the thesis, Francis Bacon Concept of Public Consent, Political-Textological Analysis, complies with the order of St. Petersburg State University on the order of awarding scientific degrees, and the applicant Tsaregorodtsev Sergey Stanislavovich deserve being awarded the degree of the Candidate of Political Sciences in Major 230001, Theory and Philosophy of Politics, History and Methodology of Political Sciences. Points 9 and 11 were not violated. Thank you very much. Now I'd like to give the floor to Professor Kulakova Tatiana Alexandrovna. Thank you very much, Vladimir Alexandrovich. I believe that we have all noted a very clear-cut report that the applicant presented. This report fully reflected all the key ideas of the thesis. I will agree with my colleagues that the targets, objectives, and goals of the thesis are logically and clearly identified. The text itself is rather static and highly intellectual. I'm not going to ponder upon all the positive aspects of the thesis because they can be found in the review. I had only a minor remark which I would like to voice. It seemed to me that the energy and the power of Bacon cannot be compared with modern political concepts, which under the dictatorialship of normative approach, it makes them so lifeless, so linear, that you marvel, how could a person who served the crown, who participated in all the intrigues, who conducted certain political framework, could raise to such height of knowledge? I can only thank Sergey Stanislavovich for the pleasure that we got when reading the text. But nevertheless, in the second chapter, which has the name The Key Principles, the fourth paragraph, the concept of consent by Bacon and the modern political theory, has to include comparative analysis according to the name. So there should be identifying the ground for comparisons, the ideas of English thinker and the concepts that can be found in the modern day literature, predominantly Anglo-Saxon literature. But we identified the comparisons only at the very end of the paragraph. Although Francis Bacon can be considered one of the teachers of Thomas Hobbes, his attitude to classic contractian tradition is more than reserved, and the cause for such reserve is found on the surface. Any version of any public agreement, despite its abstract nature, has rhetorical elements based on the political pressing issues. Thus, rhetoric connotations have always been not typical for Bacon. He never wanted to follow Thomas More. This is why the New Atlantis has no speech by Raphael Gitladay. One of the historical outcomes of such intellectual policy resulted in the fact that Bacon ideas of social consent in a way act as prerequisites to the skeptical position that is characteristic of the work of Herbert, Gautier and Force, who identify the principle of golden margin in their works in different ways. Take into account the fact that modern philosophical literature dedicated to the problem of consent, few references to Bacon works can be found. It can be understood that the short summary conclusions found in the paragraph as to the prerequisite nature of ideas of Bacon to the works by Herbert and Gautier are not enough. Nevertheless, my remark does not decrease the importance and the scientific value of all the provisions of the thesis, but nevertheless I'd require the author to provide a comment. The list of reference is rather expansive for the work of such time. The thesis by Sergey Tsaregorodtsev on the topic Francis Bacon Concept of Public Consent, Political-Textological Analysis complies with the key requirements set by the order from the 1st of September 2016 on the procedure of awarding scientific degrees at St. Petersburg State University. The applicant, Tsaregorodtsev Sergey Stanislavovich, deserves being awarded the scientific degree of Candidate of Political Sciences, Major 230001, Theory and Philosophy of Politics, and History and Methodology of Political Sciences. Points in 9 and 11 haven't been violated. And my special personal thanks for talking about the works by Mikhail Kissel, who is very bright professor of Leningrad State University, the Department of Philosophy. Thank you. Thank you, Tatiana Alexandrovna. Now I would like to give the floor to Oleg Mikhailovich. Dear members of the Dissertation Council, dear colleagues, I'd like to ponder upon the ideas that haven't been discussed yet. Textological analysis as an approach or as a method of research in political science shows its high efficiency, and that today's defense acts as a good role model of it. And the concept of public consent by Francis Bacon of political textological analysis. The phenomenon of consent in political sciences and political practice in modern Russia is of crucial importance nowadays. The problem of consent in the issue of development of social politics is extremely pressing. Agreement, disagreement, belief, disbelief, scientists and sociologists discuss it, but nevertheless there is no uniform model of the future development. If there is silent consent or quiet consent, then there is no such consent that Bacon wrote about and other political scientists wrote about. It is not formed yet. The choice by the applicant of the topic is the first attempt to discuss the works of such eminent scientist. Paradoxically, several decades after Bacon's death, there were major declarations and documents that emerged. And we usually remember the scientists who worked after him. This period was cut, probably because it was controversial, but nevertheless, controversy doesn't mean that there was no deep scientific role. I'd like to say a few words about the applicant. The applicant made a number of interesting research moves. Thus, when talking about the phenomenon of consent, the applicant talks about the phenomenon of information. And the author talks about different layers or different sides of how information influences the dynamics and the processes of that time, and it sounds very modern and is in a way typical for polittechnology. It is interesting that 300 years before the information revolution, this question was posed in such an educational manner. Another interesting feature of the thesis is that political sciences are specific sciences and very complex. And we understand very often why the courses of political sciences get shortened and why the science of politology is considered not a part of political sciences but as a separate one. I would also like to pay attention to the fact that the applicant talks about the nature of moral principles of people and the interpretation by Francis Bacon, which are based on the principles of accumulated knowledge, and much information, much attention is dedicated to the educational aspect. The philosophy of industrial sciences is also identified. Knowledge is the driving power of the world history. We know that Francis Bacon laid the basis of the idea that knowledge means power. The ideas and the conclusions which formed the ground of the Bacon's idea of the concept and are of fundamental character, and form the basis of social and political sciences. Several times we use the quantitative analysis and the use of the term. Such characteristics can be identified with the philosophical approach of slow reading and the accuracy of the dissertation plan, of the provisions for defense, of the novelty. The work itself is linked to the fact that this text was slowly and gradually reread, readdressed, and improved. We can't say that the author of the New Organon analyzed not only Francis Bacon but also the context of the formation. Sergey Stanislavovich discusses the context in detail and identifying it where necessary. Finalizing my remarks, I would like to say that I really liked paragraph 3 where Francis Bacon talks about the ways of achieving public consent. And I suppose that this paragraph is one of the key features of the thesis, where we can see the historical, political, and economic context. I would also like to note that there are many interesting passages in the thesis. I suppose that this thesis is fully fledged and I will vote for it, but I need to provide a remark. And my remark is linked to the modern day context, linked to the idea that the dissertation thesis analyzes the works of modern day scientists, which shows that international discussion linked to the interpretation of different versions of the concept of consent can be viewed itself as a certain approach in political science. But nevertheless, today the issue, how can the philosophy by Francis Bacon, which originated in the early modern period, be in line with this modern day discussion? On the whole, I'd like to say that I fully support this research paper. In the written form, I stated that it complies with all the norms and regulation of the Dissertation Council of this scientific and research center. And I would like to say that Tsaregorodtsev deserves being awarded the scientific degree of Candidate of Sciences, Political Sciences, Major 230001.
Спасибо, Олег Николаевич.
Thank you, Oleg Mikhailovich. And now, according to the procedure, I need to voice my remark. I will talk about certain aspects of my review, and I'm not going to voice it in its entirety. The thesis is dedicated to complex and pressing problem of social political philosophy of the early modern, the analysis of concept of public consent by Francis Bacon, a great English philosopher, state official and a great researcher. Bacon had universal mind. He was not also a philosopher, he was an active lawmaker and thinker. Although natural philosophy were his priority, but he talked much about religion, moral, and the acts of people, myths, poetry, and law. What we lack is the rational approach to the history of the mind of Bacon, which could analyze the whole range of his ideas in their historical context. And in my opinion, Sergey Stanislavovich Tsaregorodtsev, in his dissertation thesis, provided detailed political textological analysis of different aspects of interpretation of public consent, and laid foundation in creation of analysis of social political works by Bacon. Currently, this work is at the initial stage, since epistemological project that Francis Bacon talks about his works requires no less than the absolute renovation of the human knowledge. And we don't know the political and philosophical basis of this project. For example, Canadian philosopher Lawrence Lumbert says that in order to understand the political philosophy of English thinker, we only need his later work, New Atlantis. But nevertheless, I would like to say that Tsaregorodtsev's works shows that this naive thesis is not applicable, and the author looks at the entire range of the works by Francis Bacon. Well, you can see my review on the website of St. Petersburg State University, so I'll move on to the remarks. Along with plethora positive aspects of the work, I would like to talk about the logical lacunes in the thesis. The author says that the activity on political and administrative work took most part of the life of the Francis Bacon. Scientific research were of subordinate role. They were used as instruments and were dedicated to solve the current political issues. In my opinion, this approach is excessive. I think that Boris Podoroga came to this issue much closer in his work, stating that Francis Bacon was not a researcher, unlike Galilei, Gilbert, Frege, Kepler. He was not a specialist in a particular field of studies, if we don't talk about legislative sciences. Francis Bacon was the reformer of the science. His task was in creating universal principles. For him, it was necessary to bring to life different conditions according to which science could be possible as a process of delivering knowledge from the nature and production of technological innovations. Thus, it is based on the fundamental problem of the lack of the principles of development of science. If we talk about the discussion on priorities, Podoroga says that science no longer is the servant of theology. It gives information based on objective viewpoint of the world. And this approach can be found not only at university, which were subject to the influence of theology, but in scientific organizations, in the royal court. Thus, the works by Halley, Harvey, Bragi, and Bacon that were formed starting from 16th till the 17th century were worked under the aegis of the royalty and absolutism. One of the most famous works by Halley, dedicated to the Jupiter moons, was issued by him when he was the court philosopher to Cosimo II Medici. Thus, the politics, legal sciences, philosophy, and science of research do not serve as instruments. But the question is, which sphere of Bacon's life was considered to be the priority one? But I have a very clear association that the ideas of Bacon were very close to those of Pythagorean Samos, and when talking about the term philosophy. Well, of course, the above-mentioned remark, which pays attention to the lack of homogeneous interpretation of priorities and subjective approach to the work of Bacon, can be viewed as secondary. According to its content, the thesis complies to the requirements of the Order 6821/1 of St. Petersburg State University on the procedure for awarding scientific degree. And Tsaregorodtsev Sergey has been awarded the scientific degree of Candidate of Political Sciences, made 23/0001, the theory and philosophy of politics, history and methodology of political sciences. Points 9 and 11 of the procedure of awarding academic degrees were not violated by the applicant. Thank you very much. Thus, I'd like to conclude my remarks, and we can give the floor to the applicant. Sergey Stanislavovich, the floor is yours. The answers to the review by Professor of St. Petersburg State University, Volkova Alexandra Vladimirovna. Dear Anna Vladimirovna, first let me thank you for your attitude towards my thesis. Your great interest and your positive approach is of great value. I'm happy that the ideas that you voiced absolutely congruent with what I wanted to define in my work. Your high professional level allowed you to briefly and to the point pay attention to the most important aspects of the thesis. Thank you for your positive review. Response to the review of the member of the Stations Council, the Doctor of Political Sciences from Kazakhstan. Sergey Poltash Mohamedovich, I'd like to thank you for your high professional and positive review on my thesis. First remark was about the lack of the information on the ideological congruency of Francis Bacon and Hobbes. If we talk about the congruity of the works of Francis Bacon and Thomas Hobbes have been studied by me for several years, and a number of works are published. There used to be a paragraph in my thesis, but the colleagues who considered this paragraph superfluous, we had to exclude it. But we'll come back to this point once again, because as you've justly remarked, this remains interesting. As for the disproportion of certain parts of the thesis, you're absolutely right. The fourth paragraph of the fourth chapter is larger, disproportionately larger than all the other paragraphs. But unfortunately, it was not possible to shorten it. As for conclusions, we tried to identify the results of the thesis in their integrity. Thank you very much for your positive remark. Response to the member of the Decision Council, Doctor of Political Sciences, Associate Professor, the Professor of the Department of Political Strategy and the Faculty of Politology, Kulakova Tatiana Alexandrovna. Dear Tatiana Alexandrovna, first of all, let me thank you for taking part in the dissertation thesis committee. Your marvelous review is highly professional. You have pointed all the positive sides of the work. At the same time, you pointed to a certain flaw of one of the paragraphs. Indeed, the link between the philosophy on consent with similarity with modern concepts was not comparatively analyzed. So I fully agree with your remark, and in my future works I will try to work on this comparative analysis. Thank you very much for your positive review considering my work. The response to the review of the Doctor of Political Sciences, the head of the Institute of Sociology in Federal Sociological Center, Russian Academy of Sciences, Mikhail Mikhailovich. Esteemed Oleg Mikhailovich, thank you very much for your consent to be part of the Dissertation Council and act as the opponent of my thesis. I had the luxury of getting to know your works on the topic of public consent. That's why I fully understand the professional level of your review, which is so clear-cut. There was a very interesting question in your review. How does the philosophy on consent by, for instance, Bacon is in line with the modern day discussion of modern scientists linked to the interpretation of different versions of the concept of consent? I need to say that the approach of, for instance, Bacon and modern sciences have only the similar approach or direction. Nevertheless, there are many differences if we talk about the nature of public consent and the decisions based on that. Thus, Bacon thought about the duality of human brain, dichotomy of social and communal. For many Western scientists, only individual aspect is important. At the same time, many scientists are interested in communal images, and those dealing with community sciences create artificial forms. Bacon clearly identifies the main positions that can be found in the person: the desire to have children and the desire to achieve knowledge. Thus, not artificial but real forms of community are interesting for Bacon, such as family, for example. The society has to identify the general idea, general line of values and priorities. Among those, the most important ones are the safety of the country and the state, the educational bringing up of the next generation, and healthcare of the people. Oleg Mikhailovich, thank you very much for your positive review. Response to the review of the chairperson of the Decision Council, the head of the Department of Theory, Department of Politics, the Department of Politics in Petrova State University, Gutorov Vladimir Alexandrovich. Deeply esteemed Vladimir Alexandrovich, I would like to thank you for taking part in this Decision Council and being the head of the Decision Council. St. Petersburg State University and your being the chairperson demonstrate the high level of my defense. A man with positive ideas, there was a remark about the subjective approach to the works by Bacon. In particular, the idea that the hypothesis of the author on the primarity of the political ideas is far-fetched, and this is one of the minuses of the thesis. I agree with your opinion, but I would like to say a few words to defend myself. It is well known that active and successful politicians have very full life, and they don't have any time to do anything. But if we talk about Bacon as having his life concentrated upon politics, the question arises: where did he find time to get different courses? But we have the collision of two incongruent parts of human activity. In Bacon, we find the example of a great politician and outspoken scientist, and we can provide a number of arguments for it. Many of Bacon's comrades talked about analytical opportunities of Bacon. Then they paid attention to the choice of scientific research. This is not found in our everyday life, and this is the same for people of all ages. Bacon was interested in philosophical aspects starting from his youth and later on, possibly because of his parents. The second aspect is linked to a small number of his works that were written during civil service. If we talk about major works, there are three of them: the Experience, New Argonon, and the worksheets to analyze the natural effects. The next work, dedicated to Henry VI, was written after his resignation. It's worth noting the time that was spent on writing each of the works. The Experiences, which entailed a number of letters, was published throughout 30 years. It means that about 2 articles a year were written. As for the next work, then it took him about 10 years to finish this work. The New Organon work hasn't been identified, but many say that it was more than 10 years. It took more than 10 years writing it. Thus, a sheer estimation of the time that scientists paid to the science and state work shows how interested he was in both. Thank you very much. You can take your seat. Now I'd like to ask the representative of the technical services. Well, there is nobody in the hall, so I'm not asking about anybody willing from the hall to participate with the questions. Thus, we are asking you about the questions received via email. After viewing the broadcast, no questions have been sent. Then we move to the next point of the procedure, and we give the floor to the scientific advisor. The floor is yours. Alexander Andreevich, the floor is yours. Dear participant, dear chairperson, dear members of the Decision Council, thank you very much for giving me the floor. First of all, I'd like to open a small secret. Many years ago, Sergey Stanislavovich, with his works, came to philosophers first and was consulting Vladimir Vasilievich Mironov. Vladimir Vasilievich recommended him to address me, and more than 4 years ago we started our cooperation. As for the research by Sergey Stanislavovich, this research is for the first time carried out in the historical and political sciences. Sergey Stanislavovich bases his research on different textological sources, primarily and predominantly English-speaking ones. The classical Cambridge publication of Bacon works. Also, different types of works and contemporary works are used. Some English texts that were translated by the author into Russia and used in the work previously were not used. In this respect, I would like to note that Sergey Stanislavovich is characterized by accuracy in his work with reference sources. And such accuracy allows him not only to identify the textual material, but also to summarize all the information presented. And a couple of words should be added to that. If we talk about the textological innovations, apart from specifying a number of passages in the works by Bacon that identify this year of the parliamentary session Bacon participated in, Sergey Stanislavovich talked about the shift from 1584 was moved to 1581. So that is the beginning of the parliamentary year. And the English translator who talked about the residence, Theobald's residence as Tybalt, and Tybalt is an Irish village. And the applicant noted the misprints and the problems found in translation, or the those supporters of Henri Montmorency are called memorians or memoranceres. Who are those? Nobody knows. But nevertheless, in the classical Cambridge publication, we could find it. As for mistakes of the Russian translator of New Organon, the translator substituted the word consent for harmony, but in the classical English translation of the work, we use the term consent. The translator also turned Bacon's ideas of mind were turned into the education of spirit. But Bacon himself talked about animi as mind, not the spirit. And different ideas on fixed phrases were reconsidered. Egyptian parts were linked to the biblical allusion, where the Jews missed the parts with Jewish stew, with the Egyptian stew. Different terms, connotations were also identified by the applicant, such as middle class and the political vocabulary typical for the period. And this list can be continued further on. I'd like to stop here. Sergey Tsaregorodtsev talks about different aspects of this topic for more than 7 years. More than 20 works were published, which fully represent the content of the dissertation thesis, including 2 articles published in Web of Science and Scopus. He also makes part of the first quartile, Dialogue with Time. The work was presented in 13 Russian and 4 international conferences. Worked actively at the faculty, in the Russian Society of Politologists. Not a single scientific event took part without his active participation. And the thesis itself by Sergey Stanislavovich, the concept of public consent, Bacon's concept of public consent, political-textological analysis, is a research paper on the pressing issue of the modern political science, written, as everybody marked, stylistically adequately, and corresponds to all the requirements to the candidate thesis. This is why I recommended the work for defense. Thank you very much. Now we move on to the next stage of the procedure, the final remarks. But first of all, I'd like to ask 2 questions to the members of the Decision Council. Is everybody satisfied with the answers by Sergey Stanislavovich? Yes, all are satisfied. There are no objections. Thank you. And the second question is, do the members of the Decision Council or the applicant have any objections to the procedure or certain comments linked to the procedure, those related to the remote access mode as well? No, there are no remarks. I don't have any remarks as well. Then we move on to the next point of the procedure. Now it is 5:17 Moscow time. And dear colleagues, before we start the voting procedure, we might declare a break with muted sound. How do you think do we need such a break, or we can move straight into the voting procedure? Yes, we can move straight into the voting procedure. And the applicant is present, as far as I understand. Then we continue with our session. We can hear each other. I would like to ask the question for awarding Tsaregorodtsev Stanislavovich the academic degree of the candidate of political sciences, major 230001, theory and philosophy of politics, history and methodology of political sciences, to the open roll call. I want to stress that when voting, you identify that the point 11 is not violated. It means that if the applicant used the works that had a co-authors or other authors, it has to be remarked by the applicant. The decision taken by the Decision Council is considered to be positive if no more than 3 members of the Decision Council voted for it. According to the procedure of awarding scientific degrees of Candidate of Sciences and Doctor of Sciences, submitted with State University. So we start the open roll call. Anna Vladimirovna, the floor is yours. I fully support, and I'd like to congratulate the applicant and the scientific advisor. Thank you. Tatiana Alexandrovna, your ID, please. I agree with the colleague and with all the ideas formulated by the members of the Decision Council. I support and congratulate the applicant. Oleg Mikhailovich, I reiterate my decision to support the applicant, saying that he deserves being awarded. And I, as the head of the Decision Council, agree that Sergey Stanislavovich deserves being awarded the scientific degree of the candidate of political sciences. Baltashna Mohamedovich, please say once again what you think. I vote for awarding the scientific degree. The next point is to count the number of votes, but I suppose that which is clear. I want to say that out of 5 members of the Decision Council voted for 5 people, against none, and abstained none. Nobody abstained from voting. And the decision on awarding Tsaregorodtsev Sergey Stanislavovich the scientific degree of candidate of political sciences, major 230001, theory and philosophy of politics, history and methodology of political sciences, was adopted. And then I'd like to give the floor to Sergey Stanislavovich. Dear colleagues, I would like to thank all the members of the Decision Council, especially Vladimir Alexandrovich Gutrev, for the agreement to act as experts and for high appraisal of the work and for important remarks that will help to develop my work in the future. I have lot of kind words to Sriniantsev, who trusted in me, who acted as a role model for me, and who provided me with the impetus to work. I'd like to thank my scientific partners, my colleagues in the department who supported me on this way, and without whom otherwise I wouldn't have written the work. I'd like to thank especially the Dean of the Political Faculty, Shutov Mikhail, and the Dean of Political Department, Kurchkin Alexander Vyacheslamovich, and the members of the Dissertation Council Office for their professional work and humanistic approach. Thank you, Sergey. So, the situation is such. I hope I will express our joint opinion. We all congratulate Sergey Stanislavovich on being awarded the scientific degree of candidate of political sciences, major 230001. We congratulate you on your great work and marvelous presentation. Thank you very much. And I would like to thank the scientific advisor, Professor Sriniantsev Alexander Andreevich, who gave a great textological speech and was listening to us attentively. Thank you very much. I hope that in future you will participate in the defense in person. Thank you very much. Everything was clear. Everything was perfect. I regret the fact that I'm not nearby, since I physically cannot achieve that because I'm in quarantine and I have to stay for 11 days more in quarantine. We hope that 11 days and that will be it. That will be the end of my isolation. Thank you, Alexander Klevich. I declare the meeting closed. Thank you for your participation. Please turn off the broadcast.